They called her Tribute before they called her by name, and by the time the cart reached the gate, even she had nearly forgotten the other one. The village elders had wrapped her in their cheapest wool and told her to be grateful, as if gratitude were a coin she could spend. She pressed her palm to the frost-cracked rail of the cart and watched the black gate rise out of the snow like a mouth opening, and somewhere behind it, the stewards whispered, "A king sat dying of a curse 40 winters old. A king who had not wept, had not laughed, had not once been seen to want anything since the day his father died, still frozen at the heart." They said the hold's last warmth had gone out with the old king. They said the new one only waited his turn to follow it down. What none of them said, because none of them yet knew it, was that the cracking of that curse would begin with a girl too poor to be missed, and a single tear she had never meant for anyone to see. If a story like this one finds you while you are doing something else entirely, washing a dish, folding a coat, waiting on a kettle, you might want to sit with it a moment longer than you planned. Tell me in the space below where you are when you press play. Then come back, because the gate is opening, and she has not yet stepped through it. In the 11th winter, after the hollow binding had closed its fist around Caldrus Hold, in the year the keep's own ledgers numbered 1104, Tamsin of Thistlewick stood in the tribute square with her wrists bound in a loop of plain rope. Not because anyone feared she would run, but because the old treaty demanded a bound tribute, and the treaty was 60 years older than any voice left living who might have argued otherwise. She was 24 years old, the healer's daughter of a village 3 days south by Frozen Road, and she had volunteered for the rope before her mother's fever could volunteer her instead. Thistlewick paid its debt to Caldrus Hold in grain when the harvest allowed it, and in daughters when it did not. And this had been a year of daughters. She was the 4th sent from her village in 12 winters. The first had come home within the year, silent and thin and unwilling to speak of the hold at all. The second and third had not come home. Steward Corvin Ash walked the line of that year's tribute with his hands folded into the sleeves of his charcoal robe, reading names off a ledger that had outlived 3 alphas. And when he reached her, he stopped, because she had not lowered her eyes the way the others had. "You are the healer's get," he said. Not a question. "I am," she said. "Useful, then," he said, already moving on, already writing something beside her name. "We have little use here for tribute girls who are merely pretty. Mind that you remember which one you are." The rope chafed at her wrists where the cart had jolted, and her mother's salve box sat heavy against her hip beneath her cloak, the one possession she had been permitted to carry past the gate, and she fixed her eyes on the black stone wall ahead of her rather than on Corvin's retreating back, because crying in the tribute square was a thing the other girls had warned her about. The hold did not forgive tears it had not asked for. That was when the air over the square changed, the way air changes before a storm finishes deciding to be won, and every bowed head around her bowed lower, and she understood without being told that the king had come to the wall above the gate to watch his tribute walk in, the way he did every year, the way the treaty also required. She looked up before she could stop herself. He was a shape of black fur and iron at that distance, tall against the gray sky, a crown no thicker than a finger pressed flat against a dark hair, and even from the square she could feel the particular stillness of him, a stillness that did not look like calm so much as a held breath that had been held for a very long time. He did not speak. He did not need to. The whole square had gone quiet under him, the way water goes quiet under ice. And Tamsin, who had been told her whole life that she was too plain and too poor for anyone of consequence to notice, felt his attention pass over the tribute line and land, for one held second, on her. Then a guard's hand closed on her shoulder, turning her toward the gate, and the moment broke, and she told herself it had meant nothing at all. She did not yet know his name was Bram. She did not yet know that the cold she had felt rolling off that wall was not contempt, but containment, a king holding himself together one winter at a time, the way ice holds a lake together, thin and silent, and 1 degree from breaking. She knew only that something in her chest had gone tight and strange under that single look, and that she had no intention of letting it happen twice. The gate swallowed the tribute line whole, and behind it Cauldres Hold opened into a world of gray stone corridors and torchlight rationed like bread, and Tamsin walked into it with her chin level, and her wrists still bound, already, without meaning to, beginning the long work of cracking something she did not yet know was broken. The steward's clerk assigned her to the healer's stores before the rope was even off her wrists, on the strength of the single word useful, and she counted that a mercy until she saw the stores themselves, half-emptied shelves and unlabeled jars, and a head healer named Old Yare, who looked at her with the particular wariness the hold reserved for anyone who might ask questions he did not want answered. "You'll keep the kennels too," he told her. "The pup runs are short a hand since the cull." The cull, she learned within the hour, was a yearly thinning of the litters born marked. Born with some fault the kennel masters read as ill luck, a crooked paw, a blind eye, a coat that came in wrong. She found the year's marked pup in a back run alone, a black-furred runt already shoulder-high, though barely past his first months, with a single patch of frost-pale fur across his left shoulder that the kennel master called a curse stain and would not touch. He was due for the cull at week's end. Tamsin had grown up in a village that could not afford to waste anything, including pity, but she knelt anyway in the straw and let the pup press his cold nose into her palm, and something in her, the same something that had once made her father carry a stranger's fevered child 2 miles through snow, though no one had asked him to, decided the matter before her good sense caught up with it. She told the kennel master the runt had taken to her and would be no trouble in her keeping. She did not tell him she had already named the pup Wick, for the way he had pressed toward her hand like a flame finding a draught, or that she had hidden him in the healer's stores behind the salve crates, rather than leave him another night in that run. It was a small theft, a runt pup and a lie to a kennel master, and it cost her nothing that week but a few hours' sleep. She would not understand for some time yet how much it had actually bought her. She saw the king twice more in her first month at Cauldres Hold, both times from a distance, both times in passing, and both times she found herself watching longer than she meant to. He moved through his own hold, the way a man moves through a house he no longer trusts to hold his weight. Careful, contained, his hand never quite resting on anything. Once she saw a young guard fumble a salute and brace for a blow that never came. Once she saw him stop mid-stride to redirect a cart of firewood toward the kennels before the runs went cold, a small, unremarkable order any steward might have given, except that he had given it himself, in person, as if it mattered to him whether a litter of culled pups froze in the night. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings managed their holdings. That was simply the shape of the work. She did not yet have the words for what she was actually watching, which was a man holding very still, so that nothing inside him would show. The first time she came close enough to feel his cold for herself, it was by accident and by no one's design, and it left a mark on her that no rope ever had. It was Old Yare who sent her, 3 weeks into her service, with a jar of bloodroot salve and an order to leave it outside the king's private chamber and nowhere else, under no circumstance to enter, under no circumstance to speak of the errand again. The Hold's healers had treated the king's father until the day he died of his own frost, Old Yare told her, white-faced, and the current king had forbidden any healer from touching him in the 9 years since he took the circlet. "He manages it himself," Old Yare said, which everyone understood to mean he does not let anyone close enough to see how badly he is failing to manage it at all. She left the jar outside the door as instructed. She would have walked away as instructed too, if she had not heard, through the heavy wood, a sound she recognized from her own father's last winter, the particular catch of a man's breath when pain has gone past what pride can carry alone. She knocked. No one answered. She went in anyway, because that was simply what her hands did when someone was hurting on the other side of a door, whether or not her good sense had been consulted. She found him on one knee beside the hearth, one hand braced against the stone, his collar torn open at the throat where his own fingers had clawed at it, and beneath the skin of his collarbone she saw it for the first time, the thing the whole hold whispered about and no one named aloud, a lacing of pale, frost-colored veins spreading outward from somewhere near his heart like ice cracking across a pond from a single stone dropped through. "Get out," he said, and his voice came out as rough as a man's voice comes out when it has not been raised in tenderness for a very long time. She did not get out. She knelt instead, set the salve jar between them, and reached for his hand before he could refuse her a second time. The moment her fingers closed over his, something happened that she had no name for and would spend the next several weeks refusing to name. Warmth ran from her palm into his, like water finding a crack. An impossible heat whereby every law of the curse there should have been only more cold. And beneath that warmth, she felt something else stir. Something that was not quite a heartbeat and not quite a word. A single low note answering from somewhere underneath his skin, as if her touch had asked a question his body had been waiting 9 years to answer. He went rigid. His gray eyes came up to hers, wide for half a heartbeat with something that was not anger at all, and then the wall came down behind them so fast she nearly doubted she had seen it lift. "You should not be in this room," he said, low, but he did not pull his hand away. Not yet. Not for 3 full breaths, and when he finally did, it was slow, almost reluctant, the way a man draws back from a fire he should not be standing near. She worked the bloodroot salve into the worst of the frost lacing anyway, her hands steadier than her heart had any right to be, and he let her, watching her with an attention so total it felt like standing in direct sun after a winter indoors. "You will tell no one you were here," he said when she finished. "I have no one to tell," she said, which was true, and which seemed to surprise him more than anything else she had said. She left the chamber with her pulse still loud in her ears, and the ghost of his hand's warmth printed into her palm, and she told herself, walking the long, cold corridor back to the stores, that what she had felt was only fever passing between 2 bodies, the way fever sometimes does. She told herself this several times. She did not believe it any of them. What she did not yet know, and would not learn for some weeks more, was that no healer's touch had eased that frost lacing in 9 years. Not old Years, not his father's own physicians before him, and that the king of Caldrus Hold had gone 3 days afterward without once being seen in his usual cold composure, a fact the kennel masters and the kitchen staff noted and did not understand, and which only Tamsin, had she known to look for it, would have recognized as a crack. The midpoint of that winter brought 2 things to Caldrus Hold that had not visited it together in some years: an early thaw at the gate, and a hardening in the steward's eyes whenever they passed over the healer's stores. Tamsin did not return to the king's chamber. She told herself this was wisdom. It did not stop her hands from steadying, or her breath from catching, every time his shadow crossed a doorway she happened to be standing near, which happened, she began to notice, rather more often than chance alone could explain. Once she found a second jar of bloodroot already waiting outside the stores, before she had thought to ask old Yare for more. Once, crossing the kennel yard with Wick loping at her heel, she found the run gate latched against a wind that had not been blowing an hour before, and a guard who would not meet her eyes told her the order had come from the king himself, no further explanation given. She began keeping a private ledger of these things in her own head, the way she had once kept her father's accounts, small, unexplainable kindnesses that a careful man could call duty if anyone asked him to account for them. She did not call it what it was. She did not let herself. The hall scene that finally forced the matter into the open came at the close of the thaw, when Corvin convened the household to settle the spring accounts, and found, somewhere in the tally of stores against expenditure, a discrepancy in bloodroot salve he did not care to explain to himself as anything but theft. He called her forward before the assembled household, the way a man calls forward something he intends to make an example of. "The tribute girl has been helping herself to the healer's stocks," he announced, and his voice carried the particular relish of a man who has been waiting for a reason. "Tribute is not given leave to take. Perhaps Thistlewick raises its daughters to think themselves owed something for the privilege of breathing inside these walls." She felt the heat climb her throat and did not let it reach her face. "I tended an injury," she said, which was true enough not to be a lie and not specific enough to be a confession. "Whose injury?" the steward said, and smiled the way a man smiles when he already half suspects the answer and wants it spoken aloud for the room to hear. She did not answer. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of confession, and Corvin's smile widened, and she understood, watching it, that he had not actually wanted an answer at all. He had wanted the silence. "You will return to the kennels and remain there," he said. "Tribute that forgets its station is tribute that can be reminded of it." The household watched her walk the length of the hall with her chin level, the way she had walked the tribute square 3 months before, and she thought, not for the first time, that humiliation in this place had a particular shape. A long room and many eyes and one named voice doing the carving. She did not see, because her own eyes were fixed on the door, the way the king's hand had closed slowly into a fist at his side during the whole of it, or the way his jaw had set in a manner Garin, his second, would later describe to no one but himself as the closest thing to a man biting back a growl he had witnessed from his alpha in 9 years. That same week, in the hour after the hearth fires were banked, she found him on the kennel wall above Wick's Run, alone, watching the pup chase his own frost-pale shadow across the snow, with the single-minded joy of something too young to know yet what it had survived. "You should not waste warmth on a dying thing," he said, not looking at her, his voice rough in a way that told her, even before her mind caught up to her body's reading of it, that he was not speaking only of the pup. "I don't believe he's dying," she said. "I think he's only marked." "Those aren't the same." He turned his head then, and for one unguarded moment, brief enough that she would later wonder if she had imagined it, something in his face came loose. Something that looked less like a king and more like a man who had spent 9 winters being told he was the second thing and had stopped expecting to hear otherwise. "No," he agreed. "Quiet. They are not." He left before she could answer, the way a man leaves a room he has stayed in one heartbeat too long, and she stood at the kennel wall a long while after, her own heartbeat loud and strange in her ears, and admitted to herself, finally, in the privacy of her own skull where no steward could hear it, that whatever was happening between them had a name she was not yet brave enough to say. If you have ever wanted something you were certain was not meant for you, you already know the particular ache she carried back to the stores that night. It does not announce itself kindly. Stay a while longer and watch what she does with it. What neither of them yet knew was that Steward Corvin had by then begun his own quiet study of the tribute girl from Thistlewick, and that what he found would set the whole of Caldrus Hold on a path neither the king nor the healer's daughter could turn aside. It began with a comb. A serving girl, paid in coin she would later regret, brought Corvin a single strand of Tamsin's hair pulled loose from her braid, and Corvin held it to the candlelight in his own chamber and saw, threaded through the dark auburn of it, the pale silver-white streak she had worn above her left temple since birth and had never once thought to hide, because no one in Thistlewick had ever thought it worth remarking on. Corvin had read the old records. Corvin, in fact, was nearly the only soul left in Caldrus Hold who had bothered to read them at all. the ones that predated the treaty, the ones that named the woman whose dying curse had laced frost through 3 generations of this bloodline. Marin of the Salt Reeds, the records called her, slain along with her kin by Bram's grandfather in a land seizure 40 years gone, and the records noted, in a hand gone brown with age, that the line of Salt Reed women had carried a streak of moon-pale hair above the left temple since before living memory, a mark some called a blessing and some called a curse worn openly. He did not go to the king with what he had found. A wiser steward or a more honest one might have. Corvin instead saw, in the space of 1 candlelit hour, the shape of an opportunity 40 years in the making, because a steward who controlled the only proof of a cursed bloodline standing inside the hold's own walls controlled, by extension, the manner of that curse's ending. And Corvin had no intention of letting it end in a way that did not also end with his own daughter's hand in the king's. He moved carefully after that, the way a man moves who has decided on a kill and only needs the right room to make it in. The hard clock he chose was not difficult to find, because the hold's own calendar handed it to him. The hollow moon fell that year on the last full dark of winter, 11 days out, the same night the original curse had been cast and the same night the treaty required the year's accounts, including the standing of all tribute, to be formally closed before the assembled household. It was, Corvin reflected, almost elegant. The curse had begun under that moon. It could be seen to end under it too, in whatever shape he chose to give that ending. Tamsin felt the 11 days tighten around her without understanding why. The kindnesses continued. A second blanket left at the stores, an order that excused her from the worst of the laundry detail, and she let herself, against every warning her own good sense kept issuing, begin to want them to mean what her body had already decided they meant. She found him twice more in that stretch in moments too brief and too careful to be called courtship by any name she knew. Once in the archive corridor where he asked her, of all things, what herbs grew wild near Thistlewick in spring, and listened to her answer the way a starving man listens to a description of bread. I have not asked anyone what grows where they were born in some years, he admitted, low, his eyes on her face rather than the middle-distance kings were trained to favor. I find I want to know everything you would tell me, if I asked. Then ask, she said, and her own boldness startled her as much as it seemed to startle him. He did not ask, not that day. He looked at her a long moment instead, long enough that she felt her own pulse climb into her throat and her breath go short and shallow the way it had the first time his hand had closed over hers, and she understood, watching the careful distance he kept even as he leaned a fraction closer, that whatever stood between them was being held back on purpose by a man who had learned the cost of wanting things too plainly in a hold that punished want as readily as it punished theft. She thought, in that charged, unfinished silence, that she could feel her own heart in her ears, and the warmth of him though he had not touched her, and the particular ache of wanting to close the last small distance, and knowing, somehow, that closing it would cost them both something neither was yet ready to pay. He stepped back first. "Forgive me," he said, rough, and was gone before she could answer, leaving her alone in the archive corridor with her hand pressed flat against her own chest as if she could hold the feeling in by force. "I will tell you plainly, because I think you have earned it by now. What you are watching is not yet love and not yet rescue, only two people circling the edge of something that frightens them both more than the curse does. Stay through what comes next, because the part that follows is the part the hold does not forgive easily." Corvin sprung his trap on the 9th of the 11 days, in the great hall, before the full household, with the precision of a man who had rehearsed the moment in his own head 100 times. He brought the serving girl's testimony first, the strand of hair, the silver streak, the old record of Marin of the Salt Reeds laid open on the dais table for any who could read to see. He named Tamsin a cursed spy before he named her anything else. The last living blood of the woman who had bound this Hold's wolves in frost, sent in, he claimed, under the guise of tribute, to finish what her ancestor had started. She has been seen in the king's private chamber, Corvin told the hall, his voice climbing to fill the rafters. She has been seen feeding him salves no healer prescribed. We have watched our king sicken faster in 3 months under her care than in 9 years under his own. I name this no accident. I name this the curse's own hand, reaching for the last of this bloodline through a tribute girl's touch. It was not true, not in the order Corvin gave it, and Tamsin opened her mouth to say so. But the hall had already turned to noise, frightened voices feeding each other the way fire feeds itself in dry timber, and she felt the old rope ache return to her wrists, though no rope bound them now, the particular helplessness of being spoken about rather than spoken to. Bram rose from the dais then, and for one held breath, the hall's noise dropped away entirely, because even sick, even bound by 9 years of frost, the king's rising still commanded a silence nothing else in that room could. Enough, he said. It was one word. It was, Tamsin would think later, perhaps the only word he had left to give that did not cost him more than he had to spend, because in the same breath his hand went to his own collar, to the place where the frost lacing had spread fastest in the months since her first touch. The cost of every kindness he had spent on her finally come due all at once, and the king of Caldrus Hold went to one knee in front of the full assembled household, with a sound in his throat that was not quite a word and not quite a cry. The hall erupted. Garin was at his alpha's side in a heartbeat, and old Yer and a dozen others, all of them too late to stop what was already happening, the frost lacing visibly darkening beneath his torn collar, his breath coming in shallow catches, his gray eyes finding Tamsin's across the chaos for one final clear moment before they lost their focus entirely. Corvin did not waste the opening. "The king is past any healer's saving," he announced, loud enough to carry over the panic, "and every law of this hold names the steward regent in such an hour. I will not see Caldrus Hold finished by the bloodline that began its undoing. The curse demands its price. It will have the last Salt Reed daughter at the hollow well, under the hollow moon, 2 nights hence, and not 1 hour later." She was bound again before she had finished understanding what had been decided, rope at her wrists for the second time in one winter, and as the guards led her from the hall, she looked back once and saw Bram still on one knee, held upright now only by Garin's grip on his shoulder, his eyes closed, the frost lacing crawling visibly toward his throat in a dark spreading lattice no salve in the Hold's stores could touch. 4 tribute girls had walked through Caldrus Hold's gate in the 12 years since the treaty's last renewal, and not one of them had ever walked back out free. She thought of that number in the cold stone cell where they kept her those 2 final nights, turning it over and over the way a woman turns a stone in her pocket when there is nothing else left to hold. She thought of her mother's fever and her father's 2 miles in the snow for a stranger's child, and the silver streak in her own hair that had marked her, all along, without her ever once being told what it meant. She thought of Wick, who Garin had quietly seen fed and kept through those 2 days, though no one had ordered him to, a small mercy in a hold that had stopped extending her any others. And she thought of the king on his knees, the cost of every salve and every kindness finally collected all at once and understood, somewhere in the cold dark of that second night, that she did not actually care whether the curse had any claim on her blood at all. She cared only that he was dying, and that she had not told him, plainly, while she still had the chance, what she had refused to let herself say in the archive corridor. The hollow moon rose full and colorless over Caldrus Hold on the appointed night, and the household gathered at the hollow well in the old courtyard where 40 years before Marin of the Salt Reeds had died, cursing the line that killed her, and where Corvin Ash now stood in ceremonial chains of office, reading the binding words from a record so old its ink had gone the color of rust. Tamsin stood at the well's stone lip with her wrists bound and her breath fogging white in the colorless light. And she was not thinking, in that final hour, of escape, or of the curse, or of her own life weighed against the household's fear. She was thinking only that somewhere in the hold above her, in a chamber gone cold despite every fire Garin could order lit, a man was dying who had once asked her, with his eyes if not his mouth, what grew wild near the place she was born. "Let it be done," Corvin said, and raised his hand toward her. She did not wait for the well. She tore free of the guard nearest her, the rope biting bloody into her wrist as she wrenched it loose, and ran, not toward the gate, not toward any safety the household might have expected of her, but back into the hold itself, up the long, cold stair toward the king's chamber. Because if this was to be the last hour either of them had, she was not going to spend it standing at the edge of a well reciting words written by men who had never once asked what either of them wanted. She found him exactly as she had feared, on the floor before the cold hearth, the frost lacing now a dark net across his entire throat and chest, his breath so shallow she had to kneel and press her ear near his lips to be certain it had not stopped entirely. "I am here," she said, and gathered his head into her lap the way she had once held her own father's, 6 years before, on the last night that had not ended in saving him. His eyes opened, barely, gray gone nearly white with the cold inside him, and found her face. "You should not be here," he managed, the same words he had given her the first time, except this time they came out broken. Fewer words than he meant, the way dying men speak when pride has finally stopped costing more than the truth. "I am tired of being told that," she said, and her voice cracked on it. He tried to smile. It did not finish. "Tamsin," he said, and it was the first time she had heard her own name in his mouth, and something in her chest broke open at the sound of it, the way ice breaks when the thaw finally reaches all the way down. What followed, she would never afterward be able to describe in any order that made sense, only that she felt the whole of the last 3 months rise in her at once, the rope and the kennel run and the salve jar and the archive corridor, and every kindness she had not let herself name, and that the grief she felt was not for herself at all, not for the well waiting below or the curse on her own blood, but entirely, helplessly, for him, for 9 winters of a man holding himself together one careful command at a time so that nothing inside him would show, for a boy who had watched his own father freeze and decided, alone, that he would simply never let anyone close enough to grieve him the same way. A single tear slid free and fell, and landed on the frost lacing at his throat just above his heart. The sound it made was not loud. It was, if anything, the quietest sound in the whole of that long, cold night. A single small crack, like the first give of ice on a lake in early spring, and then another, and then a dozen at once, the frost lacing splitting along its own dark lines, as if something inside it had simply been waiting 40 years for permission to let go. Bram's whole body arched once, a sound tearing out of him that was half pain and half release. And then the cold went out of him all at once, the way held breath finally leaves a chest too tired to hold it any longer. And beneath her hands she felt his heart find its proper rhythm for what she would later learn was the first time in 9 years. She did not have time to weep again before the chamber door slammed open, and Garen's voice was shouting that the hollow well courtyard had gone wrong, that something in the stones themselves had begun to shake. What had begun to shake, though none in the courtyard yet understood it, was 40 years of frost finally finding its way home to the one heart that had fed it longest in secret. Steward Corvin Ash had, for 9 years, quietly drawn a portion of the curse's frost into his own blood, through means the household would only later piece together, a slow private poisoning he had undertaken so that his alpha would weaken just enough, year over year, to need him, to lean on him, to owe him the regency he had always believed should have been his. He had never told Bram, who suspected only a steward's strange chill and a steward's strange devotion. He had never told his own daughter, who had only ever wanted the throne for love of it, and not for any plot beneath it. He had carried that private frost for 9 years, believing it gave him a hand on the curse's reins. He had not understood until the hollow well courtyard began to shake beneath his own feet, that the curse had only ever loaned him that frost, never given it, and that the moment its true binding broke, every borrowed degree of it would come due at once, in full, to the one man who had never paid honestly for any of it. Bram came down the long stair into that courtyard, not as a dying king, but as something the hold had not seen in 9 years, his collar torn open over skin gone smooth and warm and unmarked, his eyes no longer gray gone white, but gray gone dark. And the doors of the hollow well courtyard did not so much open before him as fail to remain shut, the old iron hinges shearing loose under a force the assembled household felt in their own chests before they saw its cause. The household dropped to its knees the way water drops when a dam finally gives, not in fear of him this time, but in the older, truer way. A pack kneels to the thing it has been waiting 9 years to see whole again. Corvin alone did not kneel. Corvin alone could not, because the frost he had hoarded for 40 years was already closing over his own heart in his last seconds, the debt of every borrowed winter collected in one final settling, and he went down without a mark on him, without a hand raised against him, the curse he had fed in secret finally feeding on the only soul left who had ever rightly belonged to it. Bram crossed the courtyard to where Tamsin still stood at the well's stone lip, her wrists raw and bleeding, her cloak fallen open, the whole of the hold's eyes on the two of them at once, and he did not speak first to the assembly, or to the dead steward at his feet, or to his own restored strength. He spoke only to her, and what he said was short and unpolished, and exactly the kind of sentence a man gives when he has spent 9 years learning to say nothing at all, and has finally run out of reasons to keep doing it. "You are not tribute," he said. "You were never tribute. You are the one thing this hold has owed a debt to for 40 years, and I am done letting anyone else decide how it gets paid." He took her bound wrists in both his hands, and with a single motion that drew no blade and required none, simply tore the rope free as though it had been thread. The courtyard held its silence a long moment after that, the kind of silence that comes only once. A held breath has finally been allowed to leave a body all at once, and in it, Tamsin felt every eye that had once watched her walk the tribute square now watching her stand free at its center, and she understood, in that long-held quiet, that the same room that had carved her humiliation into the air with a single named voice had just watched it undone by one as well. She thought, in that same quiet, of the 3 tribute girls sent before her in 12 years who had never walked back through that gate at all. 60 years the treaty had bound Thistlewick's daughters to that gate. That night, before the assembled household and the visiting envoy of the Saltmere pack, who had come to witness the hollow moon accounts, and stayed instead to witness something the old treaties had never accounted for at all, Bram tore the treaty itself from Corvin's ledger and fed it to the well's own dark water, and named, in its place, a new accounting that owed Thistlewick nothing further but its protection, freely given. In the weeks that followed, Caldrus Hold learned to be a different kind of cold. The frost did not vanish from the stone because winter was still winter, but the warmth that had once been rationed to single candles and single hearths spread further than anyone could remember it spreading in 9 years, into the kennels, where Wick grew tall and broad-shouldered through that spring. the frost-pale patch on his shoulder fading slowly to an ordinary silvering, no different from any wolf's winter coat. Into the kitchens, where old Yer finally restocked his bloodroot without fear of being questioned for it. Into the great hall, where Garen stood now not as a second guarding a wounded alpha, but as a man who had finally stopped expecting the worst each time he looked toward the dais. Lady Iselle, Corvin's daughter, was stripped of any claim her father's ambitions had built for her and sent home to her mother's people in disgrace. Though Bram, when Tamsin asked him whether the girl deserved worse, only said that he had buried enough debts that winter without adding one more to the ledger out of spite. The night they named Tamsin formally before the household, not as tribute and not even, yet, as bride, but simply as the woman the curse had ended for, she stood again at the same dais where Corvin had once read her ancestors' old crime aloud and felt none of the cold she had felt there before. Bram took her hand in front of the whole assembled hold, the same hand he had once told her did not belong in his chamber, and pressed it flat against his own chest where the frost lacing had been, where now there was only warm, unbroken skin and a heartbeat she could feel as clearly as her own. The rope mark on her wrist had faded to a thin, pale line by spring, and in its place Bram had a smith forge her a plain band of hold silver, not as a binding but as a choosing, the kind of mark a person wears because they want it there, and not because a treaty demands it. Wick slept that spring at the foot of her bed more often than the kennels, grown now to a size that made the serving girls startle, and the king himself, on quiet evenings, scratch absently behind one ear without seeming to notice he was doing it. And on the morning the first true thaw finally reached the hollow well, and the dark water ran clear for the first time in 40 years. Tamsin stood at its edge with her silver band catching the early light, and understood at last that some debts are paid not by what is taken from the ledger, but by what is finally, freely given.